Hello and welcome. Today we're taking a look at the new Burberry eyeshadow quads. So Burberry is working on kind of revitalizing all of their cosmetics, and they have just released 4 eyeshadow quads. Now these are permanent, they're evergreen. So we are looking at primarily neutral shades in all the palettes. There are 4 different quads and I picked up quads 2 and 4. So let's take a look at them. So packaging here you can see is going to be the same as the new eyeshadow palette, or I'm sorry, as the new powder. So the face powder and the eyeshadow palette, it is the same packaging, same size. So if you have that, you'll be familiar with it. For the opening here, I do think it's kind of like, I'd prefer having a push button, but really this is just, it's gonna be a quick closure and you just wanna pry that open. We do get a utensil. It's a double-ended foam tip applicator. And then this one here is quad number 2, Dusty Caramel. And then number 4 is called Midnight. And this one's my favorite. So let's take a look at the arm swatches before we move on to demos and details. So we do have a full-size mirror at the top here. This is going to be plastic packaging. It's flat on the top. And, you know, overall, it's nice packaging, but I do wish we had a push button instead, just because, you know, my nails, they're super short, but I do think it can be a little bit of a pain if your nails are wet or they are a bit longer. So let's go ahead and take a look at these. We're gonna start off with Dusty Caramel. If you're familiar with the Burberry big eyeshadow palettes that have come out in the last couple of years, you know, they have had some limited edition eyeshadow palettes. These formulas are the same from there. However, not all of the formulas in the eyeshadow palette are exactly the same. So these first 2 here are going to be a creamy powder. And then this one here is actually going to be more of a silky powder. So it's going to be a little bit more powdery. It shears out very easily. This last shade here in number 2 is also going to be one of those more silky powder formulas instead. So you can see Dusty Caramel is actually going to be some warmer toned browns. So they are neutrals leaning warm. We have kind of a bone shade here. It does have a touch of like a peachy gold in there. Then we have a soft warm brown, medium tone warm brown, and then this deeper brown's a little bit cooler, but it is still going to have a bit of that earthiness to it, a little bit of an orangey red in the base. Now, Midnight, you know, it just looks like your kind of traditional smoky eye palette. I have to say, I really love this one though. It swatches a little bit differently. We do have a couple of frosty white shades here. So this first shade here is going to be a creamy powder. You can see it's white with a tinge of silver. And it actually has a little bit more warmth from that silver. It's not going to be a cool tone silver. It's slightly warmer. This next shade here, this is also going to be a creamy formula. And you can see this is going to be kind of a soft nude rose. Very light, great like base lid shade. And then we have this deeper brown. And this is going to be a cool tone brown. You can see from just my finger here that this is going to be the creamy formula. So this deeper brown is going to be creamy, whereas the deeper brown in the Dusty Caramel is silkier. And that makes a difference just kind of in the application because again, the silkier powders are going to be a bit more sheer and the black here is going to be a silky powder. So you can see just in how they swatch the difference. So we have number 2, Dusty Caramel, number 4, Midnight. Let's move on to the eye swatches. So as we're watching the eye swatches, I swatched each of the shades in the palettes individually. Then I did a quick eye look with each of the palettes so you could see how all 4 of the shades kind of work together with the different finishes and so forth. And then for today's look, I combined both of the palettes. Now, my personal preference, I think that combining these 2 color stories doesn't work super well just because I think the Dusty Caramel is a little bit too warm and the Midnight a little bit too cool for them to mix very nicely together. But formula wise, they work very well. So you can see on the eye swatches pretty clearly whenever I am using a creamy shadow, you've got pretty opaque coverage, right away, versus when we're using the silky powder, it's going to be more sheer and it can build up. When we get to today's eye demo, you'll see that I put some of the deeper shades down along the lash line and cover it up a little bit with one of those creamier shades. You can see how opaque these creamy powder shadows actually are. I have to say, I personally really like the creamy powder formula. I think it is really, really nice. Now, as for finishes, our silky powders are definitely going to have a matte finish, and our creamy powders are more of a satin matte. I think because of that creaminess, that moisture kind of attracts some of the light and reflects it a little bit, giving it a softly satin finish, although it is not a true satin finish. Overall, I have to say, I think these are gorgeous. The palettes have 4.7 grams of product. They have a 2-year shelf life, and they are made in Italy. And as I mentioned, they do come with a double-ended foam tip applicator. Now, over the last few years, Burberry has released some eyeshadow palettes that have been limited edition. We had 2 9-shade eyeshadow pans, and then there was an eye and face palette. And that one is a little bit more recent than the 2 9-pan palettes. Now, if you're familiar with those formulas, the 9-pan palettes, for the most part, all of those have more of that creamy powder finish. And I would say that these new ones here are very similar to that. They are the same formula. Some of mine feel slightly creamier than the ones in those palettes, but those are older. So I would tend to say that those are probably, exactly the same. If you have the Monogram Eye and Face palette, however, those shadows in there, we have, particularly some of the mattes in there. They are more of that silky sheer powder. The mattes in the 9-pan palettes are still a bit creamier than what we're dealing with in these silky powders here. So these it's more of like a sheer, thin pigment texture, just a little bit of like silkiness on your lid versus the creamy powder. I have to say, I'm very excited that Burberry is updating their cosmetics. Some of their eyeshadows like Pale Barley, those were classics back then. And we haven't really seen them since then. They have a lot of things listed on their website as coming soon. If you're interested in purchasing Burberry cosmetics, here in the US, we can only purchase it from the Burberry website. So that is our only retailer right now. These are still pretty hard to find. And I have to say, I hope that as they start expanding their color lines and their products and they bring back more of their cosmetics that have been unfortunately discontinued, I really hope that they start expanding to some other retailers as well, because they definitely have top-notch quality. So let's go ahead and take a look at just a few comparisons. Next, this is from the Monogram collection. Here we have the Dusty Caramel. Let's just swatch a few of these. I'm just going to go ahead and swatch a lot of these down here at the bottom vertically so we can kind of see how they compare. So let's go ahead. We'll start off with this first row here. And you can see that this last shade in the first row is very similar to the third shade in Dusty Caramel. Then we're going to skip down to the bottom row and we're going to look at these two and how they compare to those in Midnight. So here is our brown. This is going to be a little bit silkier. It's a little bit warmer than even the brown here in Midnight or in Dusty Caramel. And then this shade here, let's see how this compares. This is actually going to be very similar to the second shade in Midnight. So that is the Monogram palette. So those two are pretty much the same shade. So if you're looking at our Monogram palette and the Midnight, you can see, again, this shade is basically a duplicate. These other shades, though, we don't have any exactly like it. The brown is definitely a lot cooler. We don't have a black. We do have a satiny gray here. And this lighter white shade is not in there either. So you can probably make, though, the same colors based on other palettes that you might have. Let's take a look at the other 9-pan palette. So this was the first one that released with Dusty Caramel. Let's take a look at some of these. So we're going to start off with some of these browns. We're going to do this brown here as well. And we're going to put these here on the side. You can see this one's a little bit silkier. This one is slightly creamier. You can see, although different, they're very, very close. Let's take a look at this deeper brown, and then we'll look at this lighter shade right below it. Let's see how this lighter shade compares to that bone shade here. You can see it's got a little bit more pigment, and then this brown here is going to be close. It's close, but it's a little bit, it has a little bit more red in it than that in Dusty Caramel. And there are just two additional palettes I wanted to take a look at. This one here is Cle de Peau number 2 Beach Pebbles. And I wanted to see how this compared to Dusty Caramel. So let's go ahead and swatch this. I'm going to put this one on my other arm. So the Cle de Peau palettes, we start off with kind of this, light. It's more of a soft peach. Then we have a very soft, warm, beigey brown. This shade here, it doesn't really count. It's really more of a primer. So we'll swatch it, but you're not really going to see much of that. And then we have this brown here, and you can see there's a little bit more olive in there. So I would say that they do have a vaguely similar color story. You have kind of the same undertones in there, but the Cle de Peau is going to be lighter overall. However, as you're looking at it, you can see it really is, the Cle de Peau really is just kind of a lighter version of the Burberry. So they are pretty similar. And then the first palette that came to my mind with Midnight is the Guerlain Imperial Moon. So these also have kind of a creamy texture to them, but it's not really your smooth, creamy texture that we are familiar with. It's got a little bit more grip. We also have some, very shimmery shades that are going to be, a little bit silkier or looser in general. So it's, a bit different in formula. And you can see we have this peachy shade here that is not really going to be present in the Burberry, but this shade here is the one that really made me think of Midnight. So as we're looking here at these, you can see overall, Midnight is going to be a bit cooler overall. So you can see here that the silvery shade here is a little bit cooler than that in the Burberry palette. The Burberry one is a bit more neutral. And then this last shade in the Guerlain is very similar to that in the Burberry. We just have maybe a little bit, this is a slightly different formula. So we've got a little bit more opacity with it. And then we have a really great rich black here, but then this other shade is overwhelmingly warm in comparison. So it's a warm peach versus a cool brown and a cool soft black. So that's my closest comparison. Overall, I have to say I'm very enthusiastic about these new Burberry eyeshadow palettes. I do hope that they expand the color range. I'd love to see some more cooler tone palettes from them and some colors. I know that they primarily do a lot of neutrals, but I would love to see maybe some pops of colors in there as well, some olive greens and things like that. Like the green in this monogram palette. If they did a quad inspired by that, I'd be very happy. So overall though, these are great quality. I don't think you can go wrong. So the Burberry eyeshadow palettes, they retail for $62 US each, and I think the quality is definitely there. We've been seeing a lot of price increases from like Chanel and Dior and other luxury brands, and sometimes the quality's been lacking. I have to say that these two quads that I have are definitely really great. So I actually think it is fairly priced considering their comparisons, and I'm really happy with them. I can't wait to see what they come out with next. Can't wait for them to bring back some of their blushes and highlighters. And I hope this was helpful. So thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know if you've tried these or if you're planning on trying them. And one thing I'd like to just note, if you are in the US and you're ordering from Burberry, they do require signature confirmation. You have to be home. So wherever you are getting it delivered, they often send it a day before tracking says it's going to arrive. So just something to note there. I just wanted to make that note because, as you can tell, that has messed me up quite a few times. So I hope that was helpful, and thank you so much for tuning in, and have a wonderful day.